The gunshot echoed through the desolate streets of Willow Creek, Montana, 1876, as Clara Novak clutched her father's lifeless body, his blood seeping into the dusty earth beneath them. She had known they would come eventually. Her father's gambling debts had spiraled beyond control, and Big Sam Thornton, the ruthless saloon owner, had finally lost his patience. Now her father was dead, and she was alone in a town where a woman without protection might as well be wearing a target on her back. "Miss Novak," a deep voice drawled behind her. Clara turned, tears streaming down her dirt-smudged face, to find Pete Remington standing there, his tall frame silhouetted against the setting sun. The local rancher removed his hat, revealing sun-bleached hair and eyes that had seen their fair share of hardship. "I reckon you've got about an hour before Thornton's men come looking for you two." Clara clutched her father's jacket, her fingers trembling. "Why would they? I have nothing they want. Your father owed Thornton $500. Way he sees it, you're the collateral now." Pete's expression remained impassive, but something in his eyes softened as he looked at her. "There's only one way to keep you safe." "And what might that be, Mr. Remington?" Clara asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Marry me," he said simply, as if proposing marriage was as ordinary as commenting on the weather. "You need protection. I need a wife to help run my ranch. It's a business arrangement, nothing more." Clara stared at him, this man she'd only exchanged pleasantries with at the general store. She was 22 years old with nothing to her name but a blood-soaked dress and a dead father. "Just a business arrangement?" she repeated. Pete nodded, extending his calloused hand to help her stand. "Just business. Say yes, and we ride out tonight." Clara looked down at her father's body one last time. She had no family, no money, and no future in Willow Creek. "Yes," she whispered, taking Pete's hand and sealing her fate. "I'll marry you to survive." As he helped her to her feet, Pete's expression remained solemn. "Once we say those vows, Miss Novak, we're no longer just surviving. The way I see it, now we live for each other." They were married that evening by the town's preacher, with only the setting sun as their witness. Clara wore her bloodstained dress, and Pete stood tall in his trail-worn clothes. There was no celebration, no congratulations, just a desperate pact between two strangers facing the harsh realities of frontier life. As they rode away from Willow Creek, Clara seated awkwardly in front of Pete on his sturdy chestnut gelding. She wondered what kind of life awaited her. She had married him to survive, but his words echoed in her mind. "Now we live for each other." She couldn't imagine how that would ever be true. The Remington Ranch was modest compared to some in the territory, but to Clara, who had spent her life in a small room above the general store where her father worked, it seemed vast. A two-story cabin stood proudly against the backdrop of rolling hills, with a barn and corral off to the side. Several hands moved about the property, tending to cattle and horses. "It's not much," Pete said as he helped her down from the horse, "but it's home." "It's beautiful," Clara replied honestly, taking in the wildflowers that grew along the path to the cabin door. "You're home now, too, Mrs. Remington." The name sounded strange to both of them, and an awkward silence fell between them. Inside, the cabin was sparsely furnished but clean. A wooden table with 4 chairs dominated the main room, with a stone fireplace against one wall. Pete showed her to a small bedroom at the back of the house. "This is yours," he said, setting down her single bag containing the few possessions she'd hastily packed. "Mine's across the hall." Clara turned to him, confusion evident in her expression. Like I said, this is a business arrangement," Pete interrupted, his voice firm but not unkind. "You need time to grieve your father and adjust to your new life. I'll not be adding to your burdens." Relief washed over Clara, quickly followed by an unexpected twinge of disappointment she couldn't quite understand. "Thank you," she managed. Pete nodded. "Get some rest. Morning comes early on a ranch." Left alone, Clara sat on the edge of the narrow bed, overwhelmed by the day's events. Just hours ago, she had been Clara Novak, daughter of the town's perpetually indebted clerk. Now she was Clara Remington, rancher's wife, a stranger in a strange place. She had married him to survive, but what did it mean to live for each other? She didn't have an answer as exhaustion claimed her, pulling her into a dreamless sleep, still wearing her blood-stained dress. Morning arrived with the crowing of a rooster and the smell of coffee brewing. Clara blinked awake, momentarily confused by her surroundings until the previous day's events came rushing back. Her father was dead. She was married. This was her home now. After washing her face in the basin and changing into one of her 2 dresses, Clara made her way to the kitchen, where Pete stood at the stove, frying eggs. "Good morning," she said hesitantly. Pete turned, nodding in acknowledgement. "Coffee's hot. Help yourself." Clara poured herself a cup, watching him from the corner of her eye. In the morning light, she could see him more clearly, the strong line of his jaw, the slight crinkles around his eyes that spoke of long days in the sun. He was handsome in a weathered way, she had to admit. "I'll be showing you around the ranch today," Pete said as they sat down to breakfast. "You'll need to know your way if you're to help run things." "I don't know the first thing about ranching," Clara admitted, shame coloring her cheeks. "I've never even milked a cow." Pete's expression softened slightly. "You'll learn. We all start somewhere." After breakfast, Pete gave her a tour of the property. He introduced her to the ranch hand's Mike, a grizzled older man who'd been with Pete since the beginning. Tom, a young fellow barely 20 with dreams of his own spread someday. And Ernesto, a skilled Mexican vaquero who could ride better than anyone Clara had ever seen. Mrs. Remington. They each greeted her, tipping their hats with a mixture of curiosity and respect. Clara felt like an imposter, but she held her head high and offered small smiles in return. The barn housed 6 horses, including Pete's chestnut gelding, Thunder. Clara hesitantly stroked the nose of a gentle mare named Daisy. "She's yours if you want her," Pete offered. "Every rancher's wife needs her own horse." Clara looked at him in surprise. "I've never ridden before." "Like I said, you'll learn." There was almost a smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "Can't have my wife walking everywhere." The cattle grazed on the surrounding pastures, not the largest herd in Montana, but respectable enough. Pete explained the basics of ranching as they walked, and Clara tried to absorb it all, determined not to be useless in her new role. Back at the cabin, Pete showed her the vegetable garden that had clearly been neglected. "My mother used to tend this," he explained. "Been letting it go since she passed 3 years back. Thought maybe you might want to take it on." Clara knelt to examine the soil, pulling a few weeds that choked what might have been carrot tops. "I can do that," she said with more confidence than she felt. At least gardening seemed more manageable than cattle ranching. That evening, Clara cooked dinner using what she found in the pantry, a simple stew with dried beef and potatoes. Pete ate without comment, but he took a second helping, which she took as a good sign. As they sat in awkward silence after the meal, Clara gathered her courage. "Mr. Remington, Pete," he corrected. "Seems strange for my wife to call me Mr. Remington." "Pete," she amended. "I want to thank you for what you did. Taking me away from Willow Creek. Giving me a place to stay. I know this isn't what either of us planned for our lives, but I promised to work hard and earn my keep." Pete studied her for a long moment, his blue eyes unreadable. "There's no need for thanks. It's like I said, we live for each other now. That's what marriage is supposed to be, arrangement or not." Over the next few weeks, Clara threw herself into learning everything she could about being a rancher's wife. She tended the garden, coaxed it back to life with seeds purchased from the general store in the nearby town of Silver Springs. She learned to milk the cow, feed the chickens, and make butter so good that even Mike, who rarely offered compliments, nodded approvingly. Pete kept his distance, always polite but reserved. They shared meals and occasional conversation, but he never intruded on her space, never presumed upon the marriage vows they'd exchanged. In some ways, Clara was grateful for the respect he showed her. In others, she found herself wondering if he regretted his impulsive offer to save her. The first real test of their arrangement came a month after their wedding. Clara was hanging laundry on the line when she spotted a cloud of dust approaching from the direction of Willow Creek. Her heart dropped as she recognized Big Sam Thornton himself, accompanied by 2 of his men. She ran to the barn where Pete was mending a saddle. "Thornton's coming," she gasped, fear evident in her voice. Pete's expression hardened as he set aside his work and reached for the rifle that hung on the wall. "Get inside the house," he instructed. "Bar the door and don't come out until I call for you." Clara hesitated. "He'll hurt you." "I can handle Sam Thornton," Pete assured her, checking that the rifle was loaded. "Go on now." From the window of the cabin, Clara watched as the three men rode into the yard. Pete stood his ground, rifle not quite aimed but ready. "Remington," Thornton's voice carried across the yard. "Heard you got yourself a wife in a hurry." "News travels fast," Pete replied evenly. "Especially when the woman in question owes me money." Thornton dismounted, his substantial frame making the ground seem to shake. "Jacob Novak died, owing me $500. His daughter's responsible for that debt now." Pete didn't flinch. "Mrs. Remington doesn't owe you a thing. Her father's debts died with him." Thornton laughed, an ugly sound. "That's not how it works, and you know it. I'm taking what's mine, one way or another." "She's my wife." Pete's voice was steel. "You'll not touch her." "A marriage of convenience doesn't change facts," Thornton sneered. "Step aside, Remington. I don't want to kill you, but I will." What happened next unfolded in a blur. Thornton reached for his gun, but Pete was faster. A single shot rang out, and Thornton clutched his shoulder, blood seeping between his fingers. "Next one goes in your heart," Pete warned, his aim unwavering. "Get off my property and don't come back. Whatever Jacob Novak owed you, consider it settled." Thornton's men helped their boss back onto his horse, fury etched into his features. "This isn't over, Remington," he growled. "Yes, it is," Pete countered. "You come near my wife again, they'll be burying what's left of you." Clara watched as the men rode away, her hands trembling against the window pane. When Pete came inside, his expression was grim. "Are you all right?" she asked, searching his face for signs of injury. "I'm fine," he assured her. "But they'll be back, likely with more men. We need to be ready." Clara nodded, swallowing her fear. "Tell me what to do." That night, they sat at the kitchen table planning their defense. Pete taught Clara how to load and fire a shotgun, easier to aim than a rifle. He explained and outlined what she should do if Thornton's men attacked while he was out working the ranch. "I'm sorry," Clara said softly as they finished their preparations. "I've brought nothing but trouble to your door." Pete shook his head. "Thornton's had it coming for years. Man's been bleeding the territory dry with his gambling operations and loan sharking. About time someone stood up to him." "Still," Clara insisted, "you wouldn't be in danger if not for me." Pete looked at her then, really looked at her, perhaps for the first time since their wedding. "Before you came, I was just existing, running the ranch, doing what needed to be done, but not really living. Having someone to protect, someone to—" He hesitated. "Someone to live for. That gives a man purpose." Clara felt something shift between them in that moment, not romance. Not yet, but a deepening of their connection, an acknowledgement that perhaps this arrangement could become something more than mere survival. The expected attack came 3 days later, in the dead of night. Clara woke to the sound of Pete loading his rifle in the hallway. "They're here," he said when she opened her door. "At least 6 of them. Mike and the boys are covering the barn. I need you to take position by the kitchen window, just like we practiced." Clara nodded, heart pounding as she took up the shotgun and moved to her assigned spot. Through the window, she could see shadowy figures moving toward the house. The first shot came from the direction of the barn. One of their men had tried to set fire to it, and Mike had caught him in the act. After that, all hell broke loose. Bullets shattered windows and splintered the wooden walls of the cabin. Pete returned fire methodically, his aim deadly accurate. Clara held her position, terrified but determined. When a man tried to force his way through the kitchen door, she fired without hesitation, the shotgun's blast throwing her backward. The intruder screamed, clutching his leg as he retreated. The gunfight seemed to last forever, though in reality it couldn't have been more than 15 minutes. Eventually, the attackers retreated, carrying their wounded. In the sudden silence, Clara called out, "Pete." "I'm here," he answered, his voice strained. She found him in the main room, blood soaking his left sleeve. "You're hurt." "Just a graze," he insisted, but his pale face told a different story. Clara helped him to a chair and cut away his sleeve, revealing a deep bullet wound. "This needs stitching," she said, fighting to keep her voice steady. Her father had taught her basic medical skills, a necessity in a frontier town with no doctor, but this would test her abilities. Pete gritted his teeth as she cleaned and stitched the wound, his eyes never leaving her face. "You did good tonight," he told her. "Handled yourself like you were born to it." Clara tied off the last stitch, her hands bloody but steady. "I was terrified. Being brave isn't about not being scared, Pete said softly. It's about doing what needs doing despite the fear. She looked up then, meeting his gaze. Something unspoken passed between them, a recognition that they had faced death together and emerged stronger for it. Thank you, Pete said, his voice rough with emotion, for fighting beside me. Clara found herself reaching for his hand, her fingers intertwining with his. We live for each other now, remember? The attack changed things between them. The artificial distance Pete had maintained began to dissolve as they worked together to repair the damage to the ranch and tend to Mike, who had taken a bullet to the shoulder but would recover. They began to talk more openly, sharing stories of their lives before they met. Clara learned that Pete had come to Montana at 18, working as a hand on various ranches before saving enough to start his own small spread. He'd built it up over 10 years through backbreaking work and sheer determination. His parents had followed him west, but his father had died of pneumonia the first winter, and his mother had struggled on for a few more years before joining her husband. In turn, Clara told Pete about growing up with a father who loved her but couldn't resist the lure of cards and whiskey. Her mother had died in childbirth when Clara was just 8, leaving her to essentially raise herself while her father drifted further into his vices. He wasn't a bad man, she explained one evening as they sat on the porch watching the sunset. Just weak. He always believed the next hand would be the one that changed everything. Pete nodded, understanding in his eyes. Men get lost sometimes, searching for something to fill the emptiness. Have you ever felt that way? Clara asked, genuinely curious. Pete was quiet for a moment, considering her question. After my mother passed, I threw myself into the ranch, worked from sunup to sundown, fell into bed too exhausted to think. But the emptiness was always there in the quiet moments. He looked at her then, his expression open in a way it hadn't been before. Less so lately. Clara felt heat rise to her cheeks at his words and the intensity of his gaze. I'm glad, she said softly. That night, for the first time, Pete kissed her good night, a brief, gentle press of his lips to her forehead that nonetheless left Clara's heart racing long after they'd retired to their separate bedrooms. 2 months after their wedding, word came that Big Sam Thornton had been arrested by a U.S. Marshal for running an illegal gambling operation and suspicion of murder. With their immediate threat removed, life at the Remington ranch settled into a comfortable rhythm. Clara expanded the garden, adding medicinal herbs and flowers simply for their beauty. She learned to ride Daisy, at first clinging nervously to the saddle horn but eventually gaining enough confidence to accompany Pete on his daily rounds of the property. They still maintained separate bedrooms, but the distance between them continued to shrink. They worked side by side during the day and spent evenings on the porch or by the fire, talking or simply enjoying each other's company in comfortable silence. One evening in early autumn, Pete returned from town with a package wrapped in brown paper. For you, he said, looking almost shy as he handed it to Clara. Inside, she found a beautiful blue dress, finer than anything she'd ever owned. Pete, she breathed, running her fingers over the soft fabric. It's lovely, but there's a harvest dance in Silver Springs this Saturday, he interrupted. Thought maybe you'd like to go. With me. Clara looked up at him, seeing the vulnerability behind his confident exterior. This wasn't part of their arrangement, wasn't necessary for survival. This was Pete asking his wife to accompany him to a social event, almost like a proper couple. I'd love to, she replied, her smile radiant. The dance was held in the town hall, decorated with autumn leaves and pumpkins. Clara felt beautiful in her new dress, her hair arranged in soft curls rather than her usual practical braid. The townspeople, who had been curious about Pete Remington's sudden marriage, watched with interest as they entered together. Mrs. Remington, the mayor's wife, greeted her warmly. We're so glad you could join us. Pete hasn't attended a social gathering since his mother's funeral. Clara glanced at her husband, surprised. He hasn't mentioned being a recluse. The older woman laughed. Oh, not a recluse. Just dedicated to that ranch of his. We've all been hoping he'd find someone to share it with. Pete appeared at Clara's side then, offering her a cup of punch. Mrs. Holloway isn't bothering you with gossip, is she? He asked, though his tone was lighthearted. Just welcoming your bride properly, Mrs. Holloway replied with a wink before moving on to greet other guests. As the musicians struck up a waltz, Pete set down their cups and held out his hand. "May I have this dance, Mrs. Remington?" Clara placed her hand in his, butterflies fluttering in her stomach. "I should warn you, I'm not much of a dancer." "Neither am I," Pete admitted as he led her onto the floor. "We can be terrible together." They weren't terrible. Pete moved with the same quiet confidence he displayed in everything, leading Clara through the steps with a gentle hand at her waist. As they danced, Clara became aware of how perfectly she fit against him, how natural it felt to be in his arms. "People are staring," she murmured, noticing the curious glances directed their way. Pete's eyes never left her face. "Let them. They're just jealous I have the prettiest woman at the dance." Clara blushed at the compliment. "Hardly that. You don't see yourself clearly," Pete said softly. "From the moment I first saw you in that general store, asking for thread to mend your father's shirts, I thought you were beautiful." Clara missed a step, startled by his confession. "You remember that?" "I remember everything about you," Pete admitted. "The way you always thanked Mr. Jenkins when he gave you less change than he should have. The way you'd stop to help Mrs. Patterson with her packages. The way you smiled at children but looked sad when you thought no one was watching." "I had no idea you noticed me at all," Clara said, genuinely surprised. Pete's hand tightened slightly at her waist. "I noticed. Just never thought a fine lady like you would look twice at a rough rancher like me." As the music ended, they remained standing close together, the rest of the room fading into insignificance. Clara found herself wondering what it would be like to be truly married to this man who had saved her life and was now, it seemed, saving her heart as well. The ride home from the dance was quiet, but it was a comfortable silence, filled with unspoken possibilities. Pete helped Clara down from the wagon with careful hands that lingered at her waist a moment longer than necessary. Inside the cabin, with the door closed against the cool night air, they stood looking at each other in the soft glow of the oil lamp. "Thank you for tonight," Clara said, suddenly shy. "I can't remember the last time I enjoyed myself so much." Pete stepped closer, his eyes searching hers. "Clara," he began, his voice rough with emotion. "I know when we married, it was for practical reasons. You needed safety. I needed—" He broke off, seeming to struggle for words. "What did you need, Pete?" Clara asked softly, her heart pounding. "You," he said simply. "I didn't know it then, but I think I was waiting for you all along." Clara's breath caught in her throat. "Pete, I'm not asking for anything," he hastened to add. "I just wanted you to know that for me, this stopped being just an arrangement a long time ago." Clara moved then, closing the distance between them and placing her hand against his cheek. "For me too," she whispered. The kiss that followed was tentative at first, a gentle exploration rather than a passionate claim. Pete's hands settled at her waist, holding her as if she were precious, breakable. Clara wound her arms around his neck, rising on tiptoe to deepen the kiss. When they finally parted, both breathless, Pete rested his forehead against hers. "I don't want to rush you," he said. "We can take this as slow as you need." Clara smiled, feeling a happiness she'd never expected to find. "We've been married for 3 months, Pete. I'm not sure rushing is the right word anymore." That night, Clara moved her belongings into Pete's room, their room, now, and their marriage truly began. Life on the ranch continued, but with a new sweetness as Pete and Clara settled into their partnership. What had begun as a business arrangement blossomed into genuine love, evident in the small touches they shared throughout the day and the way they gravitated toward each other in any room. The hands noticed the change, exchanging knowing glances when Pete would pause in his work to watch Clara hang laundry or when she would bring him lunch in the fields, lingering longer than necessary. Mike, who had known Pete the longest, seemed especially pleased by the development. "About time that boy found some happiness," he told Clara one afternoon as they repaired a chicken coop together. "Been working himself to death for years with nothing to show for it, but calluses and an empty house." "The house isn't empty anymore," Clara replied with a smile. Mike nodded approvingly. "No, it sure isn't. And neither is his heart, by the looks of it." Winter came to Montana with a vengeance that year. Heavy snows isolated the ranch for weeks at a time, but Clara found she didn't mind the confinement. The cabin was warm and snug, and the quiet evenings by the fire with Pete were the happiest of her life. It was during one such evening, as Christmas approached, that Clara decided to share her news. She had suspected for a few weeks, but had waited to be certain before saying anything. "Pete," she began, setting aside her mending. "I have something to tell you." He looked up from the bridle he was oiling, his expression curious. "What is it?" Clara took a deep breath, suddenly nervous. "I'm going to have a baby. In the summer." Pete went completely still, the bridle forgotten in his hands. "A baby," he repeated, his voice barely audible. Clara nodded, uncertain how to read his reaction. "Are you happy about it?" In answer, Pete set aside the bridle and crossed to where she sat, kneeling before her and taking her hands in his. "Happy doesn't begin to cover it," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Clara, I never thought I'd have a family of my own. Never thought I'd find someone who'd want to build a life with me, let alone give me a child." He pressed a kiss to her hands, his eyes suspiciously bright. "You've given me everything." Relief and joy flooded through Clara as Pete gathered her into his arms, holding her as if she were the most precious thing in the world. "I love you," she whispered against his neck the first time she'd said the words aloud, though they'd been true for some time. Pete pulled back just enough to look into her eyes. "I love you too," he replied. "Have from the start, I think." As they sat together, making plans for the future and dreaming of the child that would join their family, Clara marveled at the twists of fate that had brought her to this moment. She had married Pete Remington to survive, but somewhere along the way, survival had transformed into something much richer. The new year brought challenges as well as joys. A particularly harsh cold snap in February resulted in the loss of several cattle, a significant blow to the ranch's finances. Pete worked longer hours, coming in exhausted each night, worry etched into the lines of his face. "We'll make it through," Clara assured him, massaging the knots from his shoulders one evening. "The spring calves will help us recover." Pete reached up to catch her hand, pressing a kiss to her palm. "I know. I just wanted everything to be perfect for you and the baby." "It is perfect," Clara insisted. "We have each other. We have a home. The rest is just details." Her confidence bolstered Pete's spirits, and together they weathered the difficult winter months. By the time spring arrived, bringing new growth and the promised calves, their financial situation had stabilized. As Clara's pregnancy progressed, she continued to work alongside Pete, though she accepted more help than she might have otherwise. The hands watched over her protectively, rushing to lift anything heavier than a feather and insisting she rest in the shade during the hottest part of the day. "They're worse than mother hens," Clara complained good-naturedly to Pete. "Tom actually took the broom from me yesterday, said sweeping was too strenuous." Pete laughed, his hand resting on the gentle swell of her belly. "They care about you. We all do." "I know," Clara acknowledged, covering his hand with her own. "And I'm grateful. I've never felt so belonging anywhere before." "This is where you were meant to be," Pete said softly. "With me. With us." The baby arrived on a warm July evening, after a long labor that left both Clara and Pete exhausted but exultant. Their daughter, Emma Rose Remington, entered the world with a lusty cry that immediately captured her father's heart. "She's perfect," Pete whispered, cradling the tiny bundle with hands that seemed too large, too rough for such a delicate task. Yet he held her with such gentle care that Clara felt tears spring to her eyes. "She looks like you," Clara observed, noting the wisp of blonde hair that would likely darken to match Pete's sandy brown. "Poor child," Pete joked, but his eyes never left his daughter's face, wonder evident in his expression. "Thank you," he said to Clara, his voice thick with emotion. "For her. For everything." "We did this together," Clara reminded him, reaching out to touch his arm. "Everything we have, we've built together." As summer faded into autumn, life at the Remington Ranch adjusted to include its newest member. Emma thrived under the adoring attention of her parents and the ranch hands, who competed for the privilege of holding her when Clara needed a free hand to cook or clean. Pete proved to be a devoted father, often carrying Emma with him as he performed the lighter duties around the ranch. The sight of the tall cowboy with a tiny infant cradled against his chest became a familiar one, and it never failed to make Clara's heart swell with love. 1 year after their hurried wedding, Pete suggested they renew their vows properly this time, he said, with a celebration and all. "Are you proposing to me, Mr. Remington?" Clara teased, bouncing Emma on her hip. I suppose I am, Mrs. Remington, Pete replied with a grin. What do you say? Marry me again. As many times as you ask, Clara answered without hesitation. The ceremony was held on the ranch, with friends from Silver Springs and the neighboring properties in attendance. Clara wore a proper wedding dress this time, ordered from a catalog and altered to fit perfectly. Emma, nearly 4 months old, was a well-behaved participant, cradled in Mike's arms as he stood as Pete's best man. When it came time for the vows, Pete surprised Clara by speaking from the heart rather than repeating after the preacher. Clara, he began, his voice steady despite the emotion evident in his eyes. When I asked you to marry me that day in Willow Creek, I told you it was a business arrangement. I said you needed protection and I needed a wife to help run the ranch. He paused, squeezing her hands gently. What I didn't say was that I'd noticed you for months before that I'd admired your kindness, your strength, your beauty, that I'd wanted to court you properly, but never found the courage. A murmur went through the gathered guests, and Clara felt tears welling in her eyes. When your father died and I saw the danger you were in, I grabbed at the only chance I thought I'd have to make you mine. Pete continued. It wasn't romantic. It wasn't what you deserved. But standing here now, a year later, with our daughter and the life we've built together, I can honestly say it was the best decision I ever made. Clara couldn't hold back her tears as Pete finished. I married you in haste, but I've loved you at leisure, and I promise to keep loving you for all the days of my life. When it was her turn, Clara's voice trembled slightly as she spoke. Pete, I married you to survive. I had nothing, no family, no home, no future. You offered me safety when I needed it most, and for that alone, I would have been grateful. She smiled through her tears. But you gave me so much more. You gave me a home, not just a place to live, but a place to belong. You gave me purpose and partnership. You gave me Emma. Most of all, you gave me your heart, and in doing so, you taught mine to love again. She took a deep breath before continuing. A year ago, you told me that once we said our vows, we would live for each other. I didn't understand what you meant then. I do now. Living for each other isn't just about survival. It's about building something together that's stronger than either of us could create alone. It's about finding joy in the ordinary moments and strength in the difficult ones. It's about love the kind that grows deeper with every passing day. There wasn't a dry eye among the guests as they completed their vows and sealed them with a kiss that held all the promise of their future together. The celebration that followed lasted well into the night, with music and dancing and more food than the ranch had ever seen. Clara and Pete moved among their guests, accepting congratulations and well wishes. Emma passed from arms to arms as the unofficial belle of the ball. As the evening wound down, Clara found herself standing on the porch, looking out at the land that had become her home. Pete joined her, slipping an arm around her waist and pulling her close against his side. Happy? He asked, pressing a kiss to her temple. Completely, she assured him, leaning into his embrace. And you? More than I ever thought possible, Pete replied honestly. When I look back on that day in Willow Creek, it's hard to believe how much has changed. How much we've changed. Clara nodded, understanding exactly what he meant. We've come a long way from a business arrangement. That we have, Pete agreed. Though I still maintain it was the best deal I ever made. Clara laughed, turning in his arms to face him. Even with all the trouble I brought to your door? Especially with all the trouble, Pete insisted. Life was too quiet before you. Too empty. Over Pete's shoulder, Clara could see their guests enjoying the last of the celebration. Mike was showing Tom a dance step that looked suspiciously like a jig, while Ernesto played a lively tune on his guitar. Emma slept peacefully in Mrs. Holloway's arms, untroubled by the noise around her. I never thought I'd have this, Clara admitted softly. After my mother died and my father started gambling, I stopped believing I could have a normal life. A happy one. Pete brushed a strand of hair from her face, his touch gentle. And now? Now I know better, Clara replied, rising on tiptoe to kiss him. Now I know that happiness isn't something that happens to you. It's something you build together, day by day. Like a ranch, Pete suggested with a smile. Exactly like a ranch, Clara agreed. With hard work and patience and faith that the seeds you plant will grow. As the stars emerged in the clear Montana sky, Pete and Clara Remington returned to their celebration, surrounded by friends who had become family, secure in the knowledge that what had begun as a desperate pact between strangers had grown into a love strong enough to weather any storm. 5 years passed, bringing changes to the Remington ranch. With careful management and hard work, Pete expanded their operation, adding more cattle and horses and purchasing adjacent land when it became available. The original cabin grew too, with a new wing added to accommodate their growing family. Emma was joined by a brother, Jacob Peter, named for both Clara's father and his own. At 3, Jake, as they called him, was already showing signs of following in his father's footsteps, toddling after Pete whenever he could and demanding to sit on his horse. Clara's garden had expanded into a proper farm, with vegetables and herbs that she sold in Silver Springs, building a small business of her own. Her medicinal remedies, in particular, were sought after throughout the county, and she often found herself serving as an unofficial doctor when illness struck neighboring ranches. The threat of Big Sam Thornton had long since passed after his release from prison. He'd left Montana for Wyoming, where rumors suggested he'd met an untimely end in a card game gone wrong. Clara sometimes thought of her father, wondering what he would think of the life she'd built. She liked to believe he would be proud, that he would have loved his grandchildren and the strong woman his daughter had become. One crisp autumn day, as the aspens turned golden on the hillsides, Clara sat on the porch with Pete, watching Emma teach Jake to roll a hoop across the yard. The sound of their laughter filled the air, a counterpoint to the lowing of cattle in the distant pasture. "I've been thinking," Pete said, his arm draped comfortably around Clara's shoulders. "A dangerous pastime," she teased, familiar with the tone that usually preceded one of his ambitious ideas. "What if we built a proper school?" Pete continued, ignoring her jest. "Silver Springs is growing. There are enough children now to warrant it, and it's too far for the little ones to travel daily, especially in winter." Clara considered the suggestion. It was true that educational opportunities in the area were limited. Emma would be ready for formal schooling soon, and the thought of sending her to board in town at such a young age was unappealing. "We'd need a teacher," she pointed out. "I thought of that," Pete replied. "Remember Sarah Collins, who visited her brother's place last summer? She's a schoolteacher in Boston, but mentioned she's always dreamed of teaching out west." Clara smiled at her husband's thoroughness. "You've given this some thought." "I want our children to have every advantage," Pete said simply. "And not just our children. All the ranch kids in the area deserve a chance at education." It was so typically Pete, practical yet generous, always thinking of how to improve not just their lives but the community around them. Clara had long since recognized that the quiet strength she'd first seen in him extended far beyond the physical. "I think it's a wonderful idea," she told him honestly. "Where would we build it?" They spent the rest of the afternoon discussing possibilities, eventually settling on a location midway between their ranch and the nearest neighbors, the Dawsons, who had 3 school-aged children of their own. Pete would write to Sarah Collins, and if she was interested, they would begin construction in the spring. As twilight fell and the children tired of their play, Clara called them in for supper. Jake ran to his father, demanding to be swung up into his arms, while Emma skipped ahead to help set the table, taking her responsibilities as the eldest very seriously. Over their meal, the family discussed the day's events, Emma's progress with her reading, Jake's discovery of a frog by the creek, Pete's plans for moving the herd to winter pasture. It was an ordinary conversation, filled with the small details that made up their lives. Yet Clara found herself suddenly overwhelmed with gratitude. "Are you all right, Mama?" Emma asked, noticing her mother's silence. Clara smiled at her daughter, at the blue eyes so like Pete's and the determined little chin that Clara recognized from her own reflection. "I'm perfect, sweetheart. Just thinking about how lucky we are." Later, after the children were tucked into bed with stories and kisses, Clara and Pete sat by the fire, enjoying a rare moment of quiet togetherness. "You had that look again at dinner," Pete noted, his fingers absently playing with a strand of Clara's hair. "What look?" she asked, though she knew exactly what he meant. "The one where you're seeing something the rest of us can't," Pete explained. "Like you're looking at our lives from somewhere far away." Clara leaned into his touch, marveling as always at how well he knew her. "I was thinking about the day we met, the real day, not when you proposed. I was in the general store, trying to decide if I could afford thread or if I should mend my father's shirts with what I had left. Pete nodded, remembering. You were wearing a green dress. Faded, but it matched your eyes. You bought a new hat, Clara continued. And when you paid, you left an extra $1 for Mrs. Patterson's account because you knew she was struggling after her husband died. Pete looked surprised. You noticed that? I noticed you, Clara said softly. I thought you were kind. And handsome, though I'd never have admitted it then. And now? Pete asked, pulling her closer. Now I still think you're kind and handsome, Clara replied with a smile. But I also know you're stubborn and occasionally infuriating and absolutely the best man I've ever known. Pete laughed, the sound warm in the quiet room. I'll take that as a compliment, Mrs. Remington. As you should, Mr. Remington, Clara replied, settling comfortably against his chest. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the windows with a reminder that winter was approaching. But inside, all was warmth and security, a home built on love and trust, and the shared commitment of two people who had found in each other exactly what they needed. Clara thought of the frightened young woman she had been, marrying a virtual stranger to escape danger. She thought of Pete's words on that fateful day, now we live for each other. How little she had understood then what those words would come to mean. Living for each other had meant learning to compromise and communicate. It had meant celebrating triumphs together and comforting each other through setbacks. It had meant creating a family and building a legacy that would endure long after they were gone. Most of all, it had meant discovering that love wasn't just a feeling but a choice, one they made every day, in big ways and small, to put each other first, to see the best in each other, to forgive the worst, and to never take for granted the gift they had found in their unlikely beginning. What are you thinking about now? Pete asked, noticing her thoughtful expression. Clara smiled up at him, at the face that had become as familiar and essential to her as her own. I was thinking that you were right, all those years ago. I usually am, Pete teased. But about what specifically? When you said we would live for each other, Clara explained. I didn't believe you then. I couldn't imagine how a marriage of convenience could ever be more than just an arrangement. Pete's expression softened. And now I understand, Clara said simply. Living for each other is the most natural thing in the world. It's what love is. Pete kissed her then, a kiss filled with all the tenderness and passion that had grown between them over the years. I love you, Clara Remington, he murmured against her lips. More today than yesterday, and not as much as tomorrow. Clara's heart swelled with happiness as she returned his kiss, secure in the knowledge that what had begun in desperation had blossomed into the greatest blessing of her life. She had married him to survive, but in the end, they had done so much more than merely survive. They had thrived together. As the fire burned low and the night deepened around their home, Clara and Pete remained together, planning their future and reflecting on their past, bound by a love that had transformed them both and created a life neither could have imagined when they first said, I do. In the years that followed, the Remington Ranch became known throughout the territory not just for its fine horses and cattle, but for the family that ran it, a family built on love and determination and the simple promise to live for each other, come what may. And though life on the frontier remained challenging, with its harsh winters and unpredictable harvests, Clara and Pete faced each obstacle together, their partnership only strengthening with time. The school they built became the heart of their small community, attracting families to the area and fostering connections that enriched all their lives. Sarah Collins did indeed come west to teach, eventually marrying Tom, who had stayed on at the ranch and worked his way up to foreman when Mike retired. Emma grew into a confident young woman with her mother's compassion and her father's steadfast nature, while Jake developed a talent for working with horses that surpassed even Pete's considerable skills. A third child joined the family when the others were nearly grown, a surprise daughter they named Hope, who brought renewed joy to the ranch and kept Pete and Clara young at heart. Through it all, through celebrations and sorrows, through the everyday moments that made up their extraordinary life together, Pete and Clara remained each other's strength and solace. The love that had begun in the most unlikely of circumstances continued to deepen and grow, a testament to the truth Pete had spoken on the day they wed, that sometimes the greatest adventure of all is learning to live for each other.